So a window comparator is a circuit that will generate an output within a certain range of voltages. So for example, we can draw a graph of what we want. This is Vn, and let's say between 3 and 5 volts, we would like the output to be high. So the window is said to be the range between 3 and 5, and between that range we want a high output. Now, the problem with window comparators is that when people design them, they focus on the high output, the window, when really it's much easier to design window comparators when you think about outside the window, these ranges over here. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Since there's two threshold voltages in this circuit, the 3 volts and the 5 volts, this is going to take 2 op amps. So let's just pencil them in. So there's 1 and there's 2. And we're going to take the Vn and we're going to tie that to both op amps. There's my input voltage. When it's greater than 5, we want a low. And when it's less than 3, we want a low. So what we want to do is we want to focus on, let's say, the high voltage here. And let's use the upper op amp for that. So what we want is we want to compare Vin to 5 volts. And what we want is a low within that range. So if Vn is 6, we want the output to be low. So we would tie the Vn to the negative input to pull it down, and the 5 volts to the positive input. So that will get us a low when the input is more than 5. Then for the other op amp, what we're going to do is we're going to tie the 3 volts to the other op amp, and now we're going to put in something like 2 volts. So what I'm doing is I'm working on this range down here. So if it's 2 volts on the Vn, what we want is we want the 3 volts to be greater. So we want the 3 volts tied to the negative input and the 2 volts tied to the positive input. So if the Vn is 2, it's less than 3, and therefore the output will be low. So now we need to tie both of these outputs together somehow so that when one is high and one is low, you don't get a bus contention and you don't get them working against each other. So what we want is we want both of these guys to sync current. We want them to provide lows output only. So we'll put in a couple of diodes so that current can only be pulled into the op amp. And then we will tie them together in a wire OR configuration. And the high output will come from an external resistor, which we will pull up to our desired voltage. So here, if I pull it up to 5 volts, that means that when both of the op amps are high on their outputs, which could be an open circuit, or it could be tied to high, the diodes will block that if it's a high. If they're both high, neither one of them is driving the circuit because of the diodes, and therefore the pull-up resistor takes it to 5 volts. If it's more than 5, if Vn is more than 5, then this guy pulls it low, and if it's less than 3, then that guy pulls it low. What if you want a window comparator that provides a low output? So again, you don't focus on the low range, you focus on the highs. So you design these areas, and then the output will be low in between them. So again, we're going to need 2 op amps. Vn is going to go into both of them. So there's my Vn. And I'll just set this one to the 5 volts and this one to the 3 volts. And then I'll figure out which way to assign the inputs. I want to create high outputs because I want to do this region and this region. So I need a couple of diodes that will only let these op amps do highs. And then the low will come from an external pull down resistor. So that will provide the low. So when do I want a high? Well, when it's above 5, when Vn is above 5, so let's say 6, I need a high output. So I would put a positive there and a negative there. The positive terminal is greater than the negative terminal, therefore I get a high output when it's more than 5. And then I also want a high output when the input is less than 3. So let's say 2 volts. So when I put in 2 volts, I want the 3 to be greater and therefore I will provide a high output on this bottom op amp. And then I put in the diodes to block them from shorting each other out, and a pull down resistor, and there's my window comparator to create a low output. Now I'm using these diodes because there's an assumption here that both of these op amps have an upper transistor that I need to block from putting out an output. But if I'm using an LM339, which only has a low transistor, then I don't necessarily need the diodes on there. However, the LM339 can only provide a low output, so I can't make the low window comparator because we design it so that the op amp generates the areas outside the window. So the LM339 can only be used to produce a window comparator that has a high output between two voltage ranges. So let me show you how that's done. So we can use an LM339 to create a window comparator with a high output between two voltages. Again, we're designing for the lows, and then the high is just the end result. So we're going to need two LM339s. So I'll put one in here and one in here. And now, because there's no upper transistor, we can tie both outputs directly, and there will not be a conflict where one is high and one is low, because one could be low and the other one would be open circuit. The VIN we would tie to both of them. So VIN would go to both. Let's use the top one here to do what happens when it's 5 volts or greater, and the bottom one will say it takes care of the low when it's 3 volts or less. So when the input is 6 volts, we want the output to be low, so that means that the negative terminal goes here and the positive terminal goes here. So if VIN is greater than 5, we will get a low output here, which satisfies this condition. When VIN is 2 volts or less, and I like to use examples that are definitely in the window. So when the VIN is 2 volts or less, we also want a low output. So that means that the 3 volts is going to go to the inverting terminal, and the 2 volts, the VIN, will go to the non-inverting terminal. 3 volts would be greater than 2 volts, so we would get a negative output, which would satisfy this area over here. Now, one of the things you'll notice when you do these window comparators is that once you've figured out the plus minus, if you join VIN together here in the center, when you figured out which one is positive and minus on either one, the bottom one is the same. So there's positive on the top, minus on the bottom, and there's positive on the top, minus on the bottom. So there's your window comparators.